welcome everyone to this event. This is a British-Yemeni Society event, and this is a number in a series we're putting on around the current situation in Yemen. This one is a general one, and we are focusing on two issues really: getting the parties talking, getting the issue of reconciliation. We've got a lot of expertise from the panel on that, but also, thanks to the presence of Alistair Burt, looking at the role that the UK can play. That's the particular focus of this. There has been a lot of discussion on the prospects for peace in Yemen, particularly since the Biden announcement and the distancing of the US from the Saudi military campaign. I think it's probably the correct term because the other members of the coalition have dropped away. And of course, it's the context of this is an alarming deterioration in conditions in Yemen, with the real threat of widespread famine and a massive increase in the displaced population. So we're very conscious we don't have a southern speaker for this evening. That's partly because today's talk is really more about the northern dynamic and the power struggle in the north, and of course the battle for Marib will play a prominent part. But the speakers will, of course, be talking about the situation in the south as well. British-Yemeni Society is non-political. I like to stress that. We take no sides in the conflict, but we do, I have to say, with some passion, yearn for an early peaceful solution to Yemen's troubles. The panelists will be recorded, and the record of what they say will be available on the BYF's website later. The Q&A will not be recorded, and that hopefully will allow a pretty free discussion. So I'd really like to start, and we do intend to finish quite promptly at 7:15, and each speaker will have 10 minutes to make their points. And I'd like to start, the order of the speakers will be Abdul-Ghani, Alistair Burt, Jonathan Powell, and then Ahmad. And I'd like to just start by introducing them all very quickly, and then we'll just roll very quickly between the speakers. So Abdul-Ghani is a highly respected, very insightful commentator. Many of you will know him on the Yemen political scene, really over the last 2 decades, perhaps even more. Abdul-Ghani. He's currently a senior researcher at the Sana Center for Strategic Studies. He's done research on constitutional reform, anti-corruption, governance, state building, conflict resolution, and development, quite a range of issues. So he'll be setting the scene for us tonight and outlining some of the key challenges. The Right Honourable Alistair Burt is currently Pro-Chancellor of Lancaster University. He's UK Commissioner on the International Commission for Missing Persons. For this audience, he's well known as an MP for 32 years, and Minister for the Middle East at the Foreign Office, and Minister of State at DFID, so he's had both hats. Back in the David Cameron, Theresa May eras. He's well known for his all-embracing knowledge of the Middle East, uniquely for a minister, I have to say, built up over many years, and of Yemen in particular. So Alistair will be looking at the constraints and opportunities for British policy towards Yemen. Jonathan Powell was Chief of Staff for Tony Blair, Chief Negotiator for Northern Ireland, leading to the successful ending of violence embodied in the 1998 Good Friday Power Sharing Agreement. He's authored many books on themes of making peace and ending armed conflict. He's now Chief Executive of Inter-Mediate, which he founded in 2011 to work on conflict resolution, including with ETA, FARC, and in Mozambique. So Jonathan, very pleased to have his experience here, will be reflecting on the lessons learned from other conflicts he's dealt with and with the steps towards reconciliation needed for peace. Amatalim Al-Soswa needs really no introduction to Yemen watchers or even to BYS members. She delivered our first annual lecture back in 2004. She's probably the most well-known senior Yemeni female figure, female politician with 25 years of high-level government, non-governmental, international and regional experience in peace building, human rights, gender equality and development. She has really an unmatchable CV. Among many roles, she was Yemen's first woman Minister of Human Rights, Assistant Secretary General of UNDP, Regional Director of the Arab States Bureau, and a key player in the albeit short-lived Friends of Yemen. I'm guessing, but the 2013 meeting of Friends of Yemen in London may have been the last time that she and Alistair Burt met. but perhaps not. So Ahmad will home in on solutions, having heard everyone else talk and set the scene for the Q&A. So as the speakers talk, I see Ahmad has her camera off, but she is there in the background. There she is. Good. As the speakers talk, please ask questions through the Q&A. And if you're keen to see a particular question answered, you can click on that question, or I think there's a thumbs up sign to kind of vote for it. And that means if I see a number of people voting for a question, I can make sure that gets answered. So I think Abdul-Ghani, can you start out for us?
Thank you, James. Thank you for inviting me to this function. I will speak. I'll speak about the lay of the land and the most recent military and political developments, and then I will let the conclusions and the recommendations come from Ahmad. The violence is now intense in Marib, casualties by the thousands. The Houthis are advancing towards the city, and that makes me the bearer of bad news. Actually, despite all of this, I'm optimistic, and I'll tell you why. For years, the conflict has been kept at low, endurable level, while the war economy was in command of events in Yemen. People were profiting from the Yemeni side, both sides, rather all sides of the Yemeni conflict, but also the Saudis and perhaps the Emiratis, I don't know. And the intensification of violence is now forcing all parties to do something about ending this war. The Houthis have come to within kilometers of Marib city. They can now fire field artillery to the city. It's back and forth. The tribes of Marib have been valiant, and they have stood their ground much more than anyone would have expected. But the Houthis continue to advance. And I think that their objective is not to take the city. They probably cannot take the city. The city has over 1 million population. Many of them, the majority of them actually, fled from Houthis in different parts of Yemen, and they will make their last stand there. And it would take tens of thousands of casualties for the Houthis to actually take over the city. I think what will happen is that the Houthis will skirt the city, or they will make a deal with the authorities of the city to have a peaceful handover and some kind of sharing of resources and so on. The Houthis' main objective is, in fact, to go on further east to harass the Saudis in Hadramaut and Mahra. That is because their objective is to get the Saudis to come to the table and negotiate with them on their own terms. The Saudis have been resistant to that notion, and they continue to argue that they are not party to the conflict, that they are only supporting the government side, the internationally recognized government side. And the Houthis want to negotiate directly with the Saudis. So the violence and the increase of casualties is actually a good sign that maybe this conflict is coming to an end. In the rest of the country, the West Coast, controlled by the forces of Tariq Saleh, is basically quiet despite all the noise that they make. Apparently, they couldn't send any forces to support the front in Marib. The government is in Aden, basically confined to a very limited space, and they are completely useless. Unfortunately, the conflict in the south makes it impossible for the government to base in Aden. President Hadi had, in my view, weaponized unity against his traditional foes in the south, and tried to monopolize the representation of the south over many, many years until the STC, the Southern Transitional Council, managed to wrench to get the right to a seat at the table by force. In other parts of the south, the Emiratis are in Hadramaut, the Saudis are in Mahra. That's very complicating. The Emiratis claim that they are there for counter-terrorism, but I don't think that's their only objective. I think they are there to make it difficult for the Saudis. Saudis are in Mahra because they wanted a gateway to the Indian Ocean. And that's why the Houthis are going to go after them and harass them there, force them to withdraw. Right now, I think that the Saudis have come to a point where the most they can wish for is to exit in a face-saving way out of the conflict in Yemen. And the Houthis are not giving them that. They're holding them by the neck. They want to extort as much concessions from them as possible. And many people believe that the Houthis are not interested in a peaceful conclusion of the conflict. They are not ready to share power. I think they do wish to share power. They have always expressed their interest in sharing power. It's just the terms that they will disagree with. They no longer, they're not likely to accept the idea of federalism. They want to dominate. And I think that it is going to be very difficult negotiations, but they will be willing to share power with others because that is their only way of translating their military successes into political gains. The peace process is still stalled, despite the fact that a U.S. Special Envoy has been appointed, Tim King, who has met with the Houthis in Oman recently, and I think that's a very good sign. That will force the negotiations to commence in the near future. The Houthis are still resisting direct negotiations with the Saudis and with the internationally recognized government. But if they don't negotiate with them, then Iran will probably take the gains that the Houthis have made in the battleground. So it is a matter of weeks for us to see the Houthis making a decision whether they reap the benefits of their victories or they allow Iran to reap that benefit. And with that, I'll stop and finish with the Q&A. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Abdul-Ghani. That's a fascinating analysis, and I think a bit different from some of the pictures that we've been getting from other events. So thank you so much for that. And can we move to Alistair? Are you there, Alistair? Can we please?
Yeah, I'm here, James.
Your comments. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about Yemen once again. And I'm grateful to be on the panel with such distinguished other panelists. I was asked particularly to look at the UK role in this. So forgive me if there's a little bit of background that many people will know, but I think it's important to put some things on the record. I'm not speaking as a representative of the British government anymore. I will quote from some material when I was a minister and make my conclusions clear at the end of it. Yemen was almost my first foreign visit in 2010 after I was appointed, and well remember the excitement of wanting to visit the country with all its history recognizing the difficulties in the background, the United Kingdom's past and everything else, but looking forward. I was there particularly to talk to members of the government about economic prospects and opportunity, to be working with those who were in the receipt of support and aid. Everyone knows that the issues affecting the country is a poor country, few resources, and the concept of Friends of Yemen, which has already been mentioned, was very much alive, and we're all working on that, whether it was internationally at the UN General Assembly or in local meetings as the one I was taking. And I enjoyed that first time in Yemen and enjoyed subsequent visits. I go back to 2011, the fall of Ali Abdullah Saleh, the opportunity then for the national dialogue, the people I met then, the women and young people who were active in wanting to bring democracy and something different on the back of the events of 2011 elsewhere. It was exciting and there were opportunities, and then it was all spoilt for a variety of reasons. Let me quote first from a debate that I spoke in, just to put some background for what the United Kingdom thought about this, because it's relevant. The causes of the conflict are numerous and complex. Since unification in 1990, Yemen has suffered internal power struggles, unrest and terrorist attacks. After a year of protests in 2011, the 33-year rule of Ali Abdullah Saleh transferred to President Hadi as part of a unity government brokered with regional support. A national dialogue process began that offered an opportunity for a democratic future. I remember it well. Tragically, that opportunity was lost when the Houthi insurgency movement, which claimed to have been excluded from the national dialogue process, but was encouraged by Ali Abdullah Saleh, sought to take power through violence. In September 2014, Houthi rebels took the capital by force, prompting President Hadi to flee to the southern city of Aden. The Houthis then began advancing on the south of the country. President Hadi, as the internationally recognized leader of the legitimate government of Yemen, requested military help from the Saudi-led coalition. The conflict between the government and Yemen, backed by the coalition and the Houthis and their allies, has lasted since then. The position when President Hadi was forced to flee was potentially disastrous. At that moment, there was a clear risk that the country would fall into the hands of forces avowedly hostile to Saudi Arabia, which shares with Yemen an 800-mile border that's vulnerable and porous. It was against that background that the Saudis and their allies were requested by President Hadi to intervene in March 2015, a decision that was not only justified, but legally sound. Saudi Arabia and its allies are responding to a crisis that was forced on them and poses a grave threat to international peace and security. The Saudis have frequently fired bombs and missiles into Saudi territory and continue to do so. Now, that was a speech I made in 2019, and I think that represents what the United Kingdom thought about the circumstances that constituted the start of the war and where we went from there. It's impossible not to appreciate the context of where the war was taking place. No state in the region is entire into itself. The whole area is conflicted by alliances, by the issues that have divided and separated people for far too long. And accordingly, Houthi action, which provided an opportunity for Iran to take part and support, putting the pressure on the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, that looked around the region and recognized that if the ultimate end of this was to have some Hezbollah-like force dominating Yemen, it was simply unacceptable. It's a view that the United Kingdom shared. But having said that, the efforts that were subsequently made in relation to diplomacy, again, really need spelt out. I gave evidence to the House of Lords Select Committee, again in 2019 on this. And again, it's relevant to what you want to talk about tonight in terms of the United Kingdom's position. I've set out the reason for the causes of the war as we saw them. But then what did the United Kingdom do? The House of Lords Committee says this. The minister said the United Kingdom was, quotes, on the record as having said for a lengthy period of time that we do not see a military solution to what is happening in Yemen, quotes. This has been the case, quotes, when it has been quite clear that some elements in the coalition partnership might have disagreed with that, and believed that one more heave would see success, quotes. This position had now changed. The coalition no longer believed that the war could be ended by taking, at that time, Hodeidah by force. The minister outlined the UK's constant and consistent support for diplomatic progress. Boris Johnson, as Foreign Secretary, had taken a significant part in small group meetings of like-minded nations that were essential for progress. Jeremy Hunt had been active in diplomatic efforts, travelling to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. He and I had both visited Iran as part of a number of UK visits to Tehran to try and understand more closely the relationship with the region, which the region needs to have with it. These discussions with Iran had been helpful, although such dialogue in no way precludes our concerns about Tehran, which we've made very public. The UK had done everything that we could as pen holders at the UN to encourage the efforts of successive envoys. The government had great faith in the special envoy of the UN Secretary General for Yemen, Martin Griffiths. The UK had used its best endeavours to give him the support and space that he needed in order to be able to do his job. So that sets out my view then and now of how the United Kingdom saw the conflict and what we sought to do to bring it to an end. There was nothing about the conflict that gave you any sense that it would easily be brought to an end, except by some form of diplomacy and some form of negotiation. And coming to the conclusion that virtually no war in the Middle East is actually capable of being won by anyone. All that happens is a succession of attacks and misery, and it's the public and civilian individuals who end up being caught up in it and suffering hugely. The United Kingdom sought to mitigate what was happening with its substantial humanitarian aid. I'm well aware it's in the news this week. Clearly, as someone who supports the aid process and took part in a number of pledging conferences to support UK aid, I'm disappointed at the decision that was made this week, and share the Secretary General of the UN's concern about aid for Yemen. I hope it will be possible for that to be restored over time, and I know there are plenty of efforts going on in relation to it. Nonetheless, over time, a significant amount has been given in order to try and support people in Yemen. The tragedy, of course, is how that aid is then used and what has been happening in Houthi areas and Houthi-controlled areas. It's been of some concern to me over the years that the reporting of the conflict in Yemen focuses mainly in relation to the coalition position, and very little has been said of the Houthi attacks and the way in which the Houthi control the areas which they are in possession of. It's not a good story. This week I was in contact with human rights activists in Marib and in Aden, and their stories of how women are treated by an ideological regime that is actively hostile to women's position in society and seeks subjugation don't make pleasant listening. There's been very little concentration on this. The consequence of this is that internationally, I don't think the Houthi feel any necessary reason to involve themselves in the negotiations and bring things to an end. That's something that ought to change. Going on finally in my last minute, just to say a little bit about what needs to be done now. I want to say we continue to support the UN effort. I know Martin Griffiths is active as we speak in trying to bring people to the table. I noticed Abdul-Ghani's comment about Houthi and negotiations. He said this is very difficult because they want to dominate. You can't get a negotiated settlement if one party or the other wants to dominate. On the other hand, this war has been going on for a long time. There's immense poverty in northern areas. It's not easy now for the Houthi to recruit. They are losing people. I don't think coalition forces have any interest in pursuing the war or continuing the war. Everyone wants it brought to an end, but it's got to be done in a way that will keep the peace, keep the area secure, not just between combatants that are there now, of which there are many and numerous factions, but also make sure there's no ungoverned space in order for terror to arise, as we've seen a QAP in the past. So that's the effort. I leave with one final quote, James, if I may. It's again something I said in the House of Commons. I said, it's beyond desperation to recognise that the complexities of this conflict with all the agonies of its people affected, do not allow for external actions and concerns to be on their own definitive in bringing the conflict to an end. The conflict will end when it ends by Yemenis. It's got to be a Yemeni solution. It's got to be Yemeni negotiations. It's got to be Yemenis who will own the peace. And those who are involved in the national dialogue, who had such high hopes in the past, have got to be given the opportunity to forge their country anew. I think the United Kingdom should continue to support those efforts and hope that the usual cause of the end of war, the weariness of everyone involved, brings this to an end. And I hope the United Kingdom will continue to do all it can to seek to do that.
Oh, thank you very much, Alistair, and thank you for reminding us about some of the context of the war and how it started and how it developed and how intractable it is. Jonathan, can we move to you and your comments? Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, James. And I have to admit that I'm no expert whatsoever on Yemen, so I feel a little bit of a fraud on this panel. I guess what I can bring maybe is some experience of other peace negotiations, other conflicts that have been ended. Of course, all conflicts are different and the way they end are different, but there are some interesting parallels between them in my experience, having worked on quite a few. Firstly, when I go and look at a conflict, I want to know if there is what the academics call a perceived mutually hurting stalemate. That is not just a stalemate. When I went to Libya as David Cameron's envoy in Libya, I thought, oh good, there's a stalemate 5 years ago. No one was going to win the whole country. What I hadn't bargained with was that each side could gain a little bit more territory, a little bit more money, and no one actually was hurting enough to bring about peace. That may have begun to change in Libya now, I certainly hope so. So when I look at the Houthi attack on Marib, that makes me worry that people aren't in a mutually hurting stalemate. The Houthis do think they can gain more territory, but I think they're probably kidding themselves as they think that this is going to be fundamental in their hand at the negotiating table. If you remember the British government and the American government trying the surge in Afghanistan in order to strengthen their hand with the Taliban, it did nothing of the sort. A final military effort like this very rarely makes much difference to the actual negotiation. So even if we don't have the situation for a mutually hurting stalemate in Yemen, we've got to try and create the conditions for such a negotiation to see if those conditions can actually be created. And if you think about it, even within the Houthis, there will be people who are hardline and there'll be people who are more moderate, some who are more aligned with Iran, some who are not. Just as with the IRA, when we were dealing with the Northern Ireland peace process, some wanted to go for peace, some wanted to continue fighting. And what you're trying to do is strengthen the hands of those who want to make the case for peace, those who actually want to get to an agreement. And in those circumstances, you can, if you like, manufacture a mutually hurting stalemate if you can help those moderates get their side to the table. So even though it may look extremely unpromising in Yemen, I'm not convinced it is impossible to create the conditions for a serious peace negotiation there. The second point I want to make is that I do think that Martin Griffiths, who actually incidentally helped me found Inter-Mediate in 2011 when he left the Centre for Humanitarian Dialogue, we set this up together. He promptly departed to do other things and is doing, I think, a very good job in Yemen. What Martin obviously is trying to do is to get to a ceasefire, and having got the ceasefire, get into political negotiations. I think that is the right way to do things. I think it is a mistake to get distracted with too many confidence building measures, too many small steps. The danger of getting bogged down in small steps in a negotiation is it's very hard to ever get on to the main issue. If you think of the Aceh negotiations in Indonesia, there were two lots of Aceh negotiations. The first ones before the tsunami focused on easy steps, the low-hanging fruit, as people like to call it. They focused on things like a cessation of hostilities for a short period, not a full ceasefire. And it rapidly collapsed because even on these small things, people started to argue. After the tsunami, in the second Aceh negotiations, Martti Ahtisaari, the former Finnish president, decided to go straight into the big issue, straight into the issue of what was the political settlement going to be for Aceh? Was it going to be independence or autonomy? He didn't want to deal with the easy issues first. And that worked. He managed to actually very rapidly get to a lasting agreement in Aceh, which still holds today. So I think Martin, in trying to get to a ceasefire, which will enable proper negotiations, they're very hard to conduct with fighting going on, is adopting the right issue. But then how can he get to those political issues, the most difficult ones? Often the way you do this, and this has obviously happened in Yemen as well, is trying to create a back channel. We've had the back channel between the Saudis and the Houthis that has worked relatively well at stages. It is always easier to do negotiations that are hidden from view. You don't have to make concessions in public. You can actually make some steps forward without being pulled back by your own political supporters. So I hope that those back channels will continue to work and continue to enable the sides to actually set the framework for a negotiation, to set the framework for these political issues. So I hope that a back channel will not just have been something that's been successful, but will be successful in the Yemeni talks as they go forward. Moving on to the actual agenda, the hard political issues, which I think in many ways is the most interesting thing. Again, when you look at a negotiation, you want to see if there is a zone of possible agreement. Can you imagine what the eventual agreement might be on these difficult issues? Is there anywhere where the Venn diagram crosses over? So you have issues where the Houthis, the Yemeni government, the Saudis, the Iranians, and the other parties in Yemen could actually agree. It is difficult at the moment. If you think about the militias, how are you actually going to wind these militias up? If we go back to the Kuwaiti plan at the time of the Kuwaiti mediation, that would mean the Houthis having to give up their weapons and disband before they even got any power sharing. I can't imagine they're going to settle for that now. On the other hand, you don't want to leave a militia in place, a new Hezbollah in Yemen with an armed militia there operating as an independent force forevermore, because if you do, you're very unlikely to end the conflict permanently any more than in Lebanon. The conflict is likely to go on, and it's also likely to be unacceptable for the Saudis to have a Hezbollah type militia still operating in Yemen. So what kind of answer can we come up with on those militias? What kind of imaginative thinking can we do to actually have the monopoly of force in the hands of the government, but the various parties, including the Houthis, feel safe enough to get to that kind of outcome? Secondly, on the political front, the outcome, as Abdul-Ghani said, is going to have to be power sharing. But how do we actually get to a real form of power sharing when you have disparities of power at the moment? How can you keep the Houthis in check once they're in power if they have still got armed forces who are loyal to them? And how will other parties in the country, particularly in the south, feel willing to share power with the Houthis if they fear the Houthis at any moment could use military power to suppress them? So setting up a system of power sharing, just as we're trying to think about doing in Afghanistan at the moment, is a very complicated issue. It's very hard to think not just about the issues like federalism, but the actual issues of the center of power. Who's going to have what job? How are you going to have democratic elections? How are you going to have accountability? And most of all, perhaps, and this is the most difficult thing, is how do you get to reconciliation? Because at the end in Yemen, this peace will only work if the past can be put behind people, if once they're sharing power, they can build enough confidence to live alongside each other, something we're still wrestling with in Northern Ireland. We've never had a truth and reconciliation process there, and we keep getting dragged back into the past, into the conflict, and Yemen will need that. Penultimately, on the external factors, obviously in Yemen, you have the problem of Iran's intervention, you have the problem of Saudi intervention, Emiratis, and others. That is not unique to any of the conflicts we face around the world at the moment. If you think obviously about Afghanistan, even a conflict like Burma, Myanmar, you have external intervention. It's not impossible to solve problems with external parties playing a role. If you think about Colombia, for example, where I worked for 6 years on the peace process there, Venezuela was very involved in the conflict in Colombia, but it was possible to bring Venezuela and indeed use Venezuela as a motive force to get to a settlement. But you do have to engage them. So again, I welcome the fact that Martin Griffiths has been to Tehran and talked to Iranian Foreign Ministry and other power centers in Tehran, because you're going to need the Iranians involved in some way if this is going to come to a final settlement. They are not in control of the Houthis by any stretch of the imagination, but they have their interests. And in many ways, Yemen is the easiest of the regional issues in which there could be an understanding between the Iranians and the Saudis. For them, for Iran, this is not a fundamental security issue. It's a stick for poking in the eye of the Saudis rather than anything more than that. So again, I don't want to be too pessimistic about the fact that external factors are there. It is possible, despite that, in other conflicts to get to a settlement, even if it's hard, but it does involve dialogue. It does involve the Iranians being involved in dialogue and obviously the Saudis. Lastly, I feel some optimism because of the approach being adopted by the Biden administration. Having a new administration coming in, making Yemen a priority, especially the US administration, being prepared to appoint a special envoy to work on it when they've abolished most of the other special envoys, and reversing the listing of the Houthis, which I think was a very sensible move, so they could engage with the Houthis and avoid a humanitarian crisis. The fact that they are going to themselves try and get a new footing with the Iranians and get back into the JCPOA means that Iran has an interest in working with the Americans on this issue going forward. Now, the reaction of the Houthis and of Iran to these initial steps by the Americans has been frankly pretty graceless. They haven't embraced them, they've made it harder rather than easier. Nonetheless, I do believe that if you stand back a bit and look at the disposition of power and issues, I think it does give us a way forward. So just to conclude, I'm no expert on Yemen. I find the sight of it, what's happening, the humanitarian crisis, very sad indeed. But I'm not completely hopeless. I do think that maybe the concatenation of circumstances now, if I look at this as in comparison with other conflicts around the world, maybe we could be getting to a situation where you could get to a solution, hard as it may be. But I will tell you that it will take a very long time. I'm afraid to say that the peace processes always take a long time. And in fact, they very rarely work unless they take a long time and people have an opportunity to build trust. So I'm hopeful. I hope I'm right. James.
No, thank you so much, Jonathan. My goodness, there's a lot there to for us to chew on. And let's keep some of that back for the Q&A. You know, I heard you talk about moderates. That's clearly an issue in Yemen. You talk about back channels, power sharing, and so on. You know, there's a number of issues there that we'll pick up on, or maybe Amat will pick up on. Because Amat, it's over to you. Right, thank you so much for joining us. We're very honored to have you with us. Over to you.
Thank you so much, James. I am also pleased to being invited to be part of this distinguished panel. And as the esteemed speakers have said before me, this is truly the most critical and also most dangerous times as well when it comes to the history of this current conflict in Yemen, given all the regional and the international development, not forgetting also about COVID, and it's also a direct threat to the millions of Yemenis, as has been happening or doing to so many others everywhere else. So it's very important as well to put that and everything that we are going to say within that context. But let me also try and give a very brief shot at what President Biden's announcement did to this whole new dynamic, if you will. And I think it's very important to recall when President Biden came last month and announced from the podium of the State Department that he is going to, and he has almost instructed that he's also to make sure that this war ends. And in addition to that, of course, and connected to it, it was, of course, the decision of the administration to stop the offensive support, if you will, to the coalition. And at the same time, and in the same announcement, he announced also that the United States as well will continue to defend and support also the kingdom to face the attacks that are launched from neighboring countries, and all in addition to this, that they will continue to work with them as well regarding also the other regional questions. Again, it's important and vital to remind us all that the strategic nature of the relations between the United States and that of the Saudi Arabia, one with the entire also Arab Gulf countries generally doesn't really require us to spend more time on it, but to be actually looking at this new initiative from that angle too. So when Mr. Timothy Linder King has announced as his special envoy to following on the conflict of Yemen, came also on the selection of him, selection of the special envoy was not also accidental. Linder King has a long history of working relations, and he's quite respected within the Gulf countries as well. And the last post he held before he returned to the State Department, was actually the acting chief of the United States of America embassy in Riyadh. So it is very important to start from that ground more than anything else. Second thing, of course, it goes without saying, the whole question of what we heard from all the other speakers so far and from everyone else, the humanitarian crisis that is facing Yemen and impacting Yemen for the last few years. But in particular, this year, again, also looking at the outcome of the latest conference for the humanitarian aid for Yemen and the disappointing outcome of it, as described by the UN Secretary General, in face of all the challenges and the difficulties that the Yemeni population entirely now face, but also more importantly as well, in areas where the militarization is still rising. It is very important also to mention and to refer to the ongoing onslaught, if you will, by the Houthis on Marib. And how is it also very important really to be looked at as an entrance as well of releasing the tension, of easing the situation, of making a ceasefire start from that point, so that really the rest of the other issues related to the ball of the peace negotiation can then smoothly rule from there, if truly the parties to the current conflict can truly reverse the current catastrophic really impact on it. And it's also important to remind everybody, as Abdul-Ghani said in the beginning, and the vast majority of the internally displaced people are actually residing in and also around Marib Governorate, and also in and around the city of Marib, and without putting a tag of the number of the people, whether it's 1 million or 2 million or even 4,000. By itself, it is going to be a real terrible consequences if any of those also internally displaced being harmed more than what they are harmed so far. So putting all these issues all together, and then looking at also the nature and the course of actions, if truly there is a backup, if you will, to the American initiative, if you can call it that way, and especially by the members of the Security Council, which we haven't seen so far. So it's also important then to mention the very essential role that the United Kingdom can continue to play, not just as an strategic ally to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, to the United Arab Emirates, to most of the also countries in the region, but also as all of the most important allies to Yemen. And again, Minister Alistair Burt just mentioned the references quickly to the Friends of Yemen, but I can go on and on beyond that even too. And let alone also the very specific nature of the, let's say, moral power that the United Kingdom is holding now in the United Nations Security Council, being the pen holder on issues related to the peace and security in that part of the world, and specifically on the issue of Yemen. Hence, it is very important to mention, of course, to the course of action which has been taken by the government of the United Kingdom, despite the fact that we know, of course, the financial hardship and the COVID impact on the budget, etc. But it is quite historical as well to see the slashing of the UK aid to the humanitarian relief activities in Yemen by more than 50%, was slashed into 60% of it. at this very critical moment as well of time. Now, let me return back to the possibilities of utilizing, as Abdul-Ghani also said, because, you know, it's not always easy to fetch for peace under those very accumulative and difficult and hard issues where you have civilians suffering, when you have civilians killed, when you have people attacked and kidnapped and going missing and becoming wounded, all of that. And at the same time, you think that it sounds like it's almost impossible position to come out of. But we know it is really this moment in particular where we could all be able to start resetting the rules. We also, as I said, preparing the ball to roll again in regards to issuing in the Security Council, at least, if not possible, to reissue a new United Nations Security Council resolution, because of course, we also have to weigh in whether some of the belligerents will look at any attempt to change, for example, the United Nations Security Council resolution as a sign of victory, and that will make it even become more adamant to continue the path of just fighting and incursions and using violence to use it, and between also really the casualties of such horrifying continuation of military operations too. So I think it would be also very possible when the United Kingdom thinks, and also maybe also in cooperation with the envoy, to looking quite seriously at the possibility of something really concrete from within the United Nations Security Council to getting at least a presidential statement, not necessarily to go full-fledged now and open the door for the you know, all the impossible or the uncalled for, let's say, consequences. And I think through that presidential statement, we can see also the backup and the support of the entire United Nations Security Council, non-permanent also members, in addition to the permanent members of the Security Council, including the Islamic states who are currently members of the United Nations Security Council, in addition as well to the regional representative of the Arab states, also in the United Nations Security Council, having all the countries which have been calling in all the open discussions of the United Nations to an end to this conflict, where again, as all the speakers have said correctly, that every party is saying there is no military solution to this conflict. So then the difficulty which will stem after that will be on how well and serious the internal, which is also very important, and I fully agree with James when he said in the beginning as well about the real willingness and serious willingness of the Yemeni internal part to really put that as their most important endeavor and to stop from using it as a tactic. And that will require, of course, a very clear and open discussion with the coalition, whom I believe very genuinely that they really wanted out for a long time. So I think that will set maybe the rules and the path, if you will, for going on about, you know, the peace and peace process. Here we have to think that we need a comprehensive Yemeni process that does not leave behind any of the components of the societies, any of its effective as well people, because at the end of the day, that should be their endeavor. So I'll stop here, but this is just some thought, some food for thought, or thought for food, sorry, thought for food, as we say. Thank you.
Right, thank you so much, Ahmad. My goodness, a lot of ideas there. I think we need to move to the Q&A.